For more complex projects, we may need custom configuration files to return nested objects. These custom config files can allow us to group related configuration settings by business domain. Let's say, for example, that we want to group all of our database-related settings together. This gives us the ability to store related settings in individual files and manage them independently. For demonstration purposes, let's create a new file named appconfig in the source config directory, which we'll use to represent our global application configuration. In this newly created file, let's export a factory function that returns a configuration object. The configuration object can be any arbitrarily nested plain JavaScript object. The process env object will contain the fully resolved environment variable key value pairs from our .env file. Since we have full control of the returned configuration object, we can add any required logic to cast values to appropriate types, set any default values needed, anything we would like. In our example here, you can see that we specified an object with two properties, environment and database. The environment string represents the current environment, while database is an object that has host and port properties, grouping any configuration related to our database connection here. As you can see, we are parsing database port to a number, as every process env variable is a string by default. And we even set up a fallback value port in case none was provided. So how can we utilize this new configuration file we created? If we open up the app module and look at our config module for root again, we can pass in a new property called load, which takes in an array of configuration factories. Inside this array, we can pass in our new app config, making sure to import it from the correct location. And we are all wired up. Great! So how can we access this app config object from within our classes now? Well, we can actually use the config service from the previous lesson. The get method not only allows you to retrieve the environment variable by key, but it can also traverse a nested custom configuration object we created in our custom config file. Let's open up the coffee service file and update our code to use it. Let's remove the string database host that is the name of the .env file key and access our custom configuration object instead by entering database.host. While we are at it, let's also remove the string type assertion since it is a default type anyway. Alright, let's fire up the terminal and check to make sure our application still runs properly. Perfect! We can see the localhost log is still showing up in our console. But how did this work? When we pass database.host to the config service get method, this .notation naming format is in fact a path to our host property. If you look at the appconfig file again, you will see this object. To access the host property, we need to traverse this object and pass in the .notation name you would use to access it normally in JavaScript. While this approach is acceptable for relatively simple configurations that do not have large deep nested structures, this might quickly become unmaintainable for complex configuration object hierarchies. This is because with this approach, there is no type inference and we keep entering magical strings to access these values, which can potentially lead to more errors just from a small typo. For more sophisticated structures, we'll use another feature called configuration namespaces in the next lesson that help tackle some of these shortcomings.